My name is Scott, and I'm addicted to solitude. Don't get me wrong, I like people. I just like not being around them frequently. So when I suffered an emotionally traumatic event a couple of years ago, I figured solitude would be my savior. And it was, but first I had to get over its darker counterparts, loneliness and isolation. Recently, I sat down with a grief counselor, a spiritual leader, and a matchmaker to find out what impacts of loneliness and isolation can have on your mind, your spirit, and your heart.
The thing about isolation is that it takes from the spirit, so to speak, and one must be able to identify that this loneliness or isolation is also taking from the reservoir that we use to find resilience and fortitude.
There's such a difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is that really sense of disconnectedness. You're kind of disconnected from yourself, you're disconnected from others, you're disconnected from a sense of purpose.
If you're too anxious to leave the house or too depressed to join an organization, even if you're given all the skills, you can't use them. And then the more isolated you become from not going out, the more depressed and anxious you become. So what we're really seeing is a really terrible cycle of depression and anxiety, feeding the isolation feeding the depression and anxiety. And it's a health crisis. It's a huge mental health crisis.
I went so deep into isolation that the only solution I had was for me to push myself to re-engage.
Because if you are depleted and living in isolation, it's really uncomfortable to think about stepping out of it for a lot of folks. And so challenging yourself, understanding what the risks are and whether or not they're sort of stories you're telling yourself versus actual risks, I think is important. And setting small achievable goals. You know, we're not talking about you must join an enormous community of strangers and feel comfortable and connected immediately, but what's a small way in which you can feel connected? Maybe it is reaching out to an old friend or joining a social media group.
I often say that anxiety, tension, stress lives in our chest. You know, our shoulders get tight and our breath gets kind of shallow and it lives in our chest. What would happen if we took a second breath, a deeper breath, and trusted that there was a deeper wisdom that just wanted to remind us that we're okay.
And I believe that we are meant to be social beings. We're meant to live in tribes. And we're living in a time where people are very confused about where they belong.
When we think of isolation, what it does is it depletes the connection, whether that's with other people, the world around you, community, etc. You know, where can you find connection? And looking at yourself and knowing, here's where I typically find connection, whether that's to nature or people, and then following that lead is probably the most tangible and accessible way for people to combat isolation.
Solitude is the positive side of loneliness. It's when you turn that isolation into the freedom to be completely yourself, so that you'll be better for those around you.
And I think that's a great, to me, description of solitude. You know, that deep sense of who we are, and that we actually also belong to something greater than ourselves. And that gives us the strength to face whatever it is that we need to face.
For Central Oregon Daily News, I'm Scott Elnes.